the United States of America has a really long, terrible history of discrimination against African Americans. Now, it starts obviously when lots and lots of African Americans were brought over from Africa and the Caribbean to work as slaves on American farms and in American homes and on plantations. Um, Now, thankfully, after the end of the Civil War, we see that those slaves are freed and slavery is outlawed with the 13th Amendment. Okay. Now, we have three amendments that come in at the end of the Civil War. And the first is the 13th. Then we have the 14th, which gave equal protection under the laws to those newly freed slaves. It made them citizens of the United States and also citizens of the state they lived in. And it also offered protections to those newly freed slaves from retribution from the state governments, whereas they were also offered protection under the federal government from the Fifth Amendment. And then we have the 15th Amendment, which said that you cannot discriminate the right to vote based on race. Okay, so that essentially, normal we say this as it gave black men the right to vote, but unfortunately, those black men really couldn't exercise that right for quite some time. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So these newly freed slaves were given lots of protections in these three amendments, but unfortunately, those protections weren't honored very well by state governments and the federal government very often. So most of you guys have heard of Jim Crow laws. So these were the laws that kind of came into, that were passed after the Civil War, not necessarily immediately after the Civil War, but about 50 or so years later. And the whole purpose of these laws was to make sure that Black Americans really were not getting the rights that were guaranteed to them in the Constitution. Okay, so there were laws about transportation. Okay, so waiting rooms, ticket windows, seating areas, and buses and trains, everything, every aspect of life was segregated by race. And these were actual laws, okay? And one of the reasons why they were laws and not just a custom was so then, God forbid, someone who was black sat in a seat they weren't supposed to, they could actually be arrested. Now, education, of course, was separated by race as well, libraries, and usually, as opposed to having a black library and a white library, there was usually just a white library, and unfortunately, black people were not allowed to use it. Some other laws that segregated and discriminated against Black Americans was in healthcare. So, for example, it was against the law for a white nurse to administer care to a black man. Typically, there were usually black and white hospitals as well, depending on where in the country you were. So usually, like, it wouldn't matter if you were on death's door. If you were black, they usually wouldn't let you into a, quote, white hospital. Bars and restaurants were segregated by race. Just usually, most bars and restaurants didn't serve Black Americans unless they were themselves run by Black Americans. Restaurants, bars, they were all segregated. Sometimes if you could actually, if you were a Black American and you actually could use that restaurant, just usually you had to sit outside or you had to sit in a certain section, okay? There were a lot of marriage laws. Anyone who was non-white could not marry someone who was white. There were lots and lots of states that had laws banning interracial marriage. And most of those laws were not, did not actually go out of fashion until the 1960s when we had a Supreme Court case called Loving v. Virginia, and the Supreme Court said that it was unconstitutional to not allow people to marry outside their race. And then we have housing. So there were lots and lots of laws out there making it perfectly legal for someone to deny, say, renting an apartment to someone based on their race. You could also deny someone an apartment based on their sexual orientation, if they were a single parent. And then there was also this practice called redlining, which meant that local governments actually drew like a red line on a map and told mortgage companies that they could not give home loans to African Americans or, pretty much anyone that was non-white, a home loan in certain areas of towns. Okay. So they were basically segregating towns, these local governments were, by who could get home loans where. And often people would put these covenants on their deeds when they would sell their house. You had to sign it saying that you would never sell your house to someone who was non-white. Okay, so it effectively segregated every aspect of life. Okay. Now, we obviously don't have legal segregation in this way today. So some of the ways that the government ended this segregation there were some Supreme Court cases and there were some laws. So we see in 1954, we have the Supreme Court case Brown versus the Board of Education. And in this case, the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional to separate school children based on race. They said that the previous court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, where they had previously held that separate was equal, separate but equal was okay. They now said that separate but equal is unconstitutional for a lot of reasons, mostly because it was never equal, and separating people by their race violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Okay. Then we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, so 10 years later. So 10 years later, most of the schools in the South still had not integrated at this point, and so the federal government passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, basically telling states, we will not give you any money for your states, for your school districts, if you are still segregated. Okay, so they were trying to force them to integrate by taking away their money. It also instructed the justice departments, meaning the attorney generals in those states, to sue districts that were not integrated. And eventually we see most school districts maybe finally got integrated in the late 1970s, even into the early 80s. Okay, because it was even the early 1970s and we still see that not all school districts were actually integrated. Okay, this was fought with a lot of violence and a lot of vitriol for decades. The government also has enacted something called affirmative action. And essentially, this is the idea that some universities and some workplaces will make an effort to hire someone of color in an effort, or require that employers take steps to try and hire more people of different ethnicities in an effort to try and kind of right some of these wrongs and some of this past discrimination. Also, um, most of the time, people of color are just not getting the same opportunities to go to the same schools and get tutors and extra help and all of these things. So that helps kind of even things out a little bit. But the Supreme Court has said that while they're not saying that affirmative action policies can't be in place, you just can't have a specific quota. So you can't say, well, you have to have at least 10 uh, 10 people of color on your staff. Okay. It's just that you need to take steps to try and hire more, but you don't get like a specific number. Usually those are struck down by the courts.